Hi, everyone. I'm Woody.
And I'm Gus.
Changing it up. Quick intro, which I'm doing. By the way, I got a haircut, so I'm wearing a little bit of a light hoodie. You want to see? I got a haircut today. You like it?
I've never seen
I got it all cut off.
You've looked the
I'm
same
more cut than usual.
for 20 years.
But this is my new Kiss hoodie. Anyway, quick intro.
Yes.
This is a video that neither one of us have seen, which is kind of cool. We're doing a real reaction, and it's to a legend, Sheck Exley. This is kind of the story, a little bit of a story of what happened to him. So that's it. Start it.
Let's do it.
The most intense part of this story happens after you think things could not get any scarier towards the second half of the video. Sheck and Jim are two friends that had something happen to them that they never thought would be possible. Today, I'm going to go over the detailed account of Sheck and Jim, who entered the most dangerous sinkhole in Central America.
Now I'm going to pause it because just in case everybody out there doesn't know, that isn't in the cave world, Sheck Exley, would you say, Gus, is one of the most recognized names ever in cave diving?
Yeah, he's probably the godfather of cave diving. I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, I'm stuck.
He is an absolute legend. The first director of the NSSCDS, which is the cave diving division of the National Speleological Society. He wrote the book that basically introduced the rules of cave diving that we followed. So this guy, he did not invent cave diving. He wasn't the first cave diver ever, but he is definitely kind of the face of cave diving, at least in the U.S. Even the award that we give, the highest award that we give to cave divers, is called the Sheck Exley Award, which are for cave divers that complete 1,000 safe cave dives.
Yeah, I mean, there are roads in High Springs, Florida, which we call cave country, that are named after him. He just discovered lots and lots of the passage, and certainly, like Gus said, a lot of procedures were developed by him.
Yep.
Okay, that helps you understand why we said this is such an incredible video.
Let's start the story.
Cool channel, by the way.
Sheck Exley is an American cave diver and mathematics teacher from Live Oak, Florida.
It's like Brian
He began
Kicker.
diving in 1965 at the age of 16. The same year, he entered his first cave and was hooked on diving for the rest of his life. During his career, he established many of the basic safety procedures used in cave and overhead diving today. Exley is a legend and pioneer of extreme scuba diving. He would push the limits of dive sites to explore the unseen parts. Deep down, he was a fanatic for diving, and in particular, cave diving. He broke diving world records his entire life. Exley was the first in the world to log over 100 cave dives at the age of 23. In 29 years of cave diving, he made over 4,000 dives. Exley has an unusual resistance to nitrogen narcosis, and was one of the few divers to survive a 400-foot or 120-meter open water dive on simple compressed air. Exley was the first person in the history of technical scuba diving to dive below 800 feet or 240 meters.
That would be a question for me. I wonder if you really do, or are you able to develop a resistance to nitrogen narcosis? A real resistance. I've heard different stories on this. That's a question. I don't think either one of us are capable of answering that. So that would be great for some commentary. Y'all that out there may know about that, let us know. Or was he just able to basically have enough of his senses left to complete the dive, and he was lucky that nothing went wrong during those times that he was at that depth while being severely narked? And I do not know that answer.
He was a functional narcosis guy. Some people get narked to the point they take the regulators out of their mouth because they think they can breathe water. This guy, Sheck, apparently he could function.
And I'm bringing this point up mainly because I'm always going to want to stress safety, and I don't want anybody out there to say, "Oh, you see, I've developed a resistance to being narked."
Everyone.
Because I know that I've done probably 7,000 plus dives in my life, and I definitely don't have a resistance to being narked.
Right.
And I can function, but a lot of things went wrong, I would be in pretty big trouble. So that's why I'm bringing this commentary up at this point.
A feat only 20 people have performed as of 2021. He helped standardize the usage of the octopus. The octopus is now considered an essential piece of equipment among virtually all scuba divers, whether caving or in open water. When Sheck and his friend Jim Bowden found the Zacatone sinkhole in the state of Tamaulipas, Mexico, they quickly realized it was the ultimate deep system. They didn't even have to say a word to each other and both understood that they would do everything to prepare to dive the sinkhole as soon as they could. A sinkhole is also called a cenote. The term cenote is a Spanish rendering of the Mayan word zonot, a hole in the ground. Sheck's friend Jim is a 54-year-old Texan who has devoted much of his life to exploring underwater caves throughout Central America and Mexico. Caves are his love and his life, and just about every penny he earns is poured into them. Anything left over at the end of the month, he uses to take care of the mundane things, like his mortgage and electric bill. No technical diver, however, not even Sheck, has reached the depths of the Zacatone, where hydrostatic pressure hits 487 pounds per square inch, compared with 4.7 pounds per square inch at sea level. Pressure this great can implode even the best diving equipment as easily as it could crush a styrofoam cup. Its effects on the body can be just as dramatic, making the range of psychological barriers read like an inventory of hypobaric nightmares. Barotrauma, aka the bends, oxygen toxicity, and high-pressure nervous syndrome. Any of these can result from breathing air or other gases under extreme pressure. Barotrauma often refers to the medical problems that arise from the effects of water pressure when a scuba diver is beneath the surface. Water is heavier than air, so when you dive, small changes in depth cause large changes in pressure underwater. If things are really bad, air embolism can occur. This is the most serious and most feared consequence of diving. While you are diving, gas bubbles can enter your circulatory system through the small ruptured veins in your lungs. These bubbles expand during the ascent and can pass through your heart to obstruct blood flow in the arteries of your brain or heart. Oxygen toxicity is a condition resulting from the harmful effects of breathing molecular oxygen at increased partial pressures. Severe cases can result in cell damage and death, with effects most often seen in the central nervous system, lungs, and eyes. High-pressure nervous syndrome describes the effect caused by rapidly increasing barometric pressure. Symptoms comprise dizziness, shivering, tremors, vertigo, nausea, and vomiting. The probability of experiencing HPNS, or high-pressure nervous syndrome, occurs when diving deeper than 100 feet or 120 meters. These are all severe life-threatening conditions, and this is important to remember for later in the story.
I can't pause
to combat these dangers.
That was an error. I believe he made an error there. I think he meant when you're diving deeper than 360 feet, because he said that occurs when you're diving below 100 feet or 120 meters.
Yeah.
Because you don't hear about that happening very often at recreational depths of 130. So I think he meant on the footage, like 100 meters, deeper than 100 meters.
120 meters. Yeah, and I mean, it's so crazy to see that Sheck went to past 400 feet on air.
I mean,
that's the craziest thing.
Definitely not recommended.
It's like, what's the maximum operating depth of air? Isn't it like 218? 218 feet, I believe.
And that has nothing to do with narcosis. That's just for the
oxygen
CNS
toxicity part of it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And he went to 420.
I don't know how he didn't convulse. That's all. It's really interesting.
Sheck and Jim have spent the last year going over every detail of their dive, attempting to make it, if not safe, at least survivable. Zacatone is the deepest of 5 cenotes located on a large ranch in El Rancho Asfrosa in northeastern Mexico. It is about 1,000 feet, or 335 meters across, roughly circular, and contains a deep lake. The water is warm, about 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees Celsius.
Perfect.
Highly mineralized and has a sulfurous odor. The name El Zacatone comes from the floating islands of grass, which blow across the lake from one side of the other with wind. The sinkhole's depth has attracted serious divers for many years.
How nice would it be to have that, like,
How do you
in
get
your
in
backyard? Imagine that's in your backyard right now. Oh man!
How do you get in there though? Like, I don't see any way to...
Giant stride, but getting out's
Giant
tricky.
stride? It's so high.
Yeah, you do little mountain climb. Look over there on the left. There looks like you could climb those rocks. You'd have to become a climber. So we'd have
my
to do
God.
additional training for you.
In 2007,
You'd
a
have to airlift me
multi-million
out of
dollar
here.
exploration,
Ooh, look at that.
mainly funded by NASA, was conducted to map out this sinkhole.
Wow.
Sheck and Jim's dive plan is fairly straightforward. Each diver will drop down to a near vertical cave under the weight of 200 pounds of gear, maintaining visual contact with the weighted line anchored to the bottom.
These dry
At these
gloves.
depths, the inert gases in their breathing mixture will be rapidly absorbed into their bloodstreams. Water pressure will keep those gases compressed in the form of small, harmless bubbles, that is, until the divers return to the surface. If they ascend too quickly, the decreasing water pressure will cause the gases to bubble up and out of the solution like a can of soda shaken before being opened.
Very good.
The result is the bends, an excruciatingly painful, often fatal condition. To avoid this, Sheck and Jim, after touching the bottom, will rise to the surface slowly, making decompression stops at predetermined depths for specific periods of time. This will allow the gases to be released gradually. The entire process will keep them underwater for more than 10 hours. The key is a speedy descent. The faster they reach the bottom and then start back up again, the less gas is absorbed. To that end, they'll drop at a rate of 100 feet or 30 meters
This is
per
very
minute.
well
To
said.
put this into perspective, a commercial diver descending at 1,000 plus feet would breathe through a surface-supplied hose and take upward of 24 hours to reach its destination. Sheck and Jim will be there in 12 minutes.
It's not surface supplied. It comes from the bell. And the bell is not connected to the surface. The gas is in the bell, I think. I'm not an expert in commercial diving, but I believe it all comes from the bell, which is right around the same depth the divers are going. It's not on the surface.
Another problem is air supply, because divers can't carry 10 hours worth of air on their backs. Dozens of air tanks called stage air, each holding a different mixture designed to speed compression,
This is
are
open-
tied onto the descent
open
lines
circuit
at various decompression stops. Even with these extra tanks, however, if the diver takes more than 6 breaths per minute at any point during the descent, he'll run out of gas long before making it back to the
6 breaths per minute?
They must have calculated at the depth that they were at that you would suck down that tank based on maybe their surface air consumption rate. I'm assuming he has some information to be able to state that.
Dude, imagine doing a calculation that you take tanks and you're like, as long as you breathe once every 10 seconds, you'll be fine.
I mean, when you're at
How is that not gonna panic you?
yeah, you got to be nervous. Look, it's another level, but they weren't diving rebreathers, or maybe did he ever dive a rebreather?
I don't think so.
Okay, so he never, that would have changed the
Just
game.
think
big
about
time.
that. Once every 10 seconds, you breathe in. You can breathe for 10 seconds. If you breathe within 10 seconds, you're gonna run out of air. What? What? Why can't we just drop another tank?
the surface. The goal
They'll
of
have
this
more tanks.
upcoming dive was thus declared, that within a calendar year, a dive to obtain the bottom of the Zacatone would be made by Jim and Sheck. Before diving the Zacatone, Sheck and Jim needed to do extensive preparations for such a dangerous dive.
pet.
In preparation, Sheck decided to dive a huge underwater cave at Bushman's Hole in South Africa,
Yep.
diving to 863 feet or 260 meters in this system. He used a decompression schedule developed with his own software to dive Bushman's.
Wow.
Squeezing through a 3-foot crack to enter it, he picked up the speed and descended 200 feet or 60 meters into the world's largest underwater cavern. Even to Sheck, its size was overwhelming. However, during this
must be
dive,
cool.
Sheck experienced visual, stomatic, and neurological symptoms of high-pressure nervous syndrome. The time between December and April had passed rapidly, with preparations and planning consuming day and night. Both Jim and Sheck made multiple deep air acclimation dives to prepare themselves for the 100-foot attempt. In addition to
Well, that's interesting. There he said that they made deep acclimation dives, as if he's indicating that you can get your body somewhat acclimated to diving deep on air. It's insinuated in that comment. I don't, again,
Doubt it.
you Dan folks out there, or maybe Doug Ebersol or Simon Mitchell, feel free to comment and educate us further on that. I'm not sure if that's accurate.
Yeah.
Sub 500 or 152 meter dives, Jim made over 30 dives in excess of 300 feet or 100 meters. Some were done on air to acclimate and build up his narcosis tolerance. Many of these dives included skills testing at depth, primarily problem-solving questions or tasks posed by a colleague on a dive slate while on air. It is essential that he is comfortable with an equivalent narcosis depth of 300 feet or about 100 meters.
Wow.
The bottom of the sinkhole would demand a lot more. He made one more dive to 314 feet on air, or just over 110 meters, a record on air in a cave. But it was soon eclipsed by Sheck by his dive to 420 feet or 130 meters on April 4th, 2 days before their attempts to the bottom.
Because, I don't think they had the availability of trimix and so forth then.
They have to have it. They went to 800.
So
That was my question is they have trimix, clearly, because they went to 800 feet.
Oh, yeah, they did.
Or they
go to
would have
800.
died.
Yeah, they went to 800 feet.
Right.
Okay.
So
I'm
these
wondering
guys are...
go
right.
ahead.
Why wouldn't they have trimix at 300
Yeah,
and at 200?
that's why I'm scratching my head. Like, did they not have it?
Was it like $1,000 a cubic feet?
Maybe they didn't have it here. I mean, there's something indicating that they didn't have it available.
That's what I don't understand. It's like,
Neither.
well,
I'm
they're doing
confused.
dives to 300 feet to on air to get used to getting narked. But why, though?
Yeah.
You have trimix. Just
don't know.
breathe trimix and don't get narked.
Yeah, again, sometimes we make assumptions that everybody knows what we're talking about. Divers, you can ignore this, but non-divers, what we mean by trimix is we add helium into the gas because helium doesn't give you those narcotic effects that we keep talking about. That's extremely simplified way of explaining why we're having this part of the discussion.
I want someone to explain like what's the reasoning behind it. Like it just doesn't make any sense. It's like they're doing this training to get used to getting narc, but they don't have to. Like they have trimix.
We don't know if they had it though there. I mean, where they are, maybe I don't know if that was available. They're
diving to 800, so they have to be diving with trimix. They have to.
Yeah. I don't know. It's confusing. It's a good question.
Yeah. It will be like, well, let's play football without a helmet because I want to get used to concussions.
Yeah.
Or you can just wear a helmet and still get concussion. Never mind. Yeah. It's a bad analogy.
Anyway.
Let's move on.
Sheck was very
Really
competitive with his friend Jim and would usually try to beat his records. They had tremendous respect for each other, but secretly, they were always competing. It was finally getting time to dive the Zacatone. Early in the morning on Wednesday, April 6, 1994, everybody was ready to go, and the divers with their support team assembled on the banks of the El Nacimiento River, which was connected to Zacatone. The pre-dive mood was positive and optimistic. This dive was a huge deal, and many people came out to support both Sheck and Jim. Mary Ellen Eckhoff, Sheck's ex-wife, Karen Hull, Jim's wife, and Ann Kristovich, an accomplished diver in her own right, and Marco Scary were all in attendance. Press representatives included a writer and photographer from Sports Illustrated, a photographer from Destination Discovery, and a television film crew. Also in attendance was the landowner and his family, along with a lot of local residents of the area. The weather was perfect for the dive that day, and it was beautiful in this scenic location in Mexico. The stark beauty of Zacatone's cliffs, sun-baked and barren, is breathtaking, but the diver's true interest lies at the bottom. Sheck and Jim put on all of their equipment, wished each other luck, and entered the water. In order to get into the sinkhole, you had to swim down the Nacimiento River. The river is formed by the spring run emanating from the Zacatone. A boil, which is usually caused by a fault line of hot springs, was noted on the water's surface near a limestone outcropping. Working against the river's current, the divers located a small cave and followed a northeast azimuth until they had used up their entire dive line. The dive would be accomplished on independent dive descent lines, a condition both divers favored to avoid contact with potential interference during the very rapid descent. Each of their dives would be solo by necessity. The maximum depth of this dive was unknown. They started a new dive line and swam through the 600-foot passage to the sinkhole. The late morning sun was cresting over the ridge surrounding the Zacatone as Sheck and Jim completed.
Okay, so from what I understand,
that's your answer on how they got in it.
From what I understand, so what they're saying is you have to get in on this river somewhere, and then swim, and then at some point you go in a cave, and pop out in this hole, and then you can descend.
Pretty much.
That's badass.
Yes, it is.
Did their equipment check. They're finally ready. They give each other one last nod and separate at this time to follow their respective descent lines, heading down through some mineralized sulfur clouds held in suspension, through warm water growing even darker. Flashlights now cut through the darkness. Time passed in silence as they calmed their breathing and focused their minds on what was ahead. Any small mistakes while on this dive could cause serious problems and most likely death. After some time descending, Jim glanced over at Sheck. He seemed to sense Jim's glance and nodded affirmation. Jim then submerged and hesitated at 10 feet, or about 3 meters, for a minute or so, and then went into a free fall. He had planned a descent rate of 100 feet per minute to 300 feet on air, then the same rate to 600 feet. Jim planned to slow his descent around 750 feet to 800 feet, or 243 meters.
Wow.
At this depth, this is where he previously had high pressure nervous syndrome, or HPNS.
I mean,
Jim knew that if he got this syndrome,
they have a picture of
on
the
this
Eiffel
particular
Tower in there.
dive, it would almost be a death sentence.
That's how deep
So
it is.
far, everything is going to plan. As he passed the 800-foot mark,
But you see, let me pause there for a second. If you see, there's air,
And then
to
the-
400, and then mixed all
Yeah,
the way in.
yeah,
So
yeah.
they have trimix.
Yeah.
Why don't they have mix? Like,
Yeah, quantity issues. Something
I don't get it.
that we don't know.
240 meters, he noticed a light flashing in front of him. He could see Sheck's light in the distance. Meanwhile, Sheck continued down, at a rate faster than even before. At 700 feet, or 210 meters, however, his body started going into fits. Hundreds of small concentric circles, each with a sparkling dot at its center, filled his vision. His body began itching and stinging. It was high-pressure nervous syndrome, a little understood phenomenon brought on by the severe rapid compression. The extreme pressure inhibits the function of the brain, causing the neural circuits to run wild. He hovered at about 750 feet, or 220 meters, to consider his options. Abort or continue down? He had to decide. His life depended on it. He started down again, more slowly this time, though there was little physical change. By the time the cave bottomed out at 860 feet, or 250 meters, Sheck's entire body had begun shaking uncontrollably. Sheck ignored it. He wanted to fight through this. His flashlight cut through the darkness. Even without full vision, he could make out what appeared to be a lunar landscape, a uniformly flat bottom, sloping away from him, covered with small rocks, and buried in nearly a foot of black sediment. No one had ever been or stood where he was standing. He couldn't stay down there long, since every minute of extra time he spent at that depth would eventually have to be paid for with extra hours of decompression. After he looked around his surroundings, he inflated his buoyancy control device and began to rise. He was more than halfway to the surface before the syndrome subsided. Meanwhile, Jim was at 900 feet, 274 meters, and he was shocked to find that he had breathed far more air than he had planned.
Uh-oh.
At this depth, his regulators could easily fail. This was a big problem, and Jim had to deal with it quickly. He inflated his buoyancy control device and managed to stop his descent at 920 feet, or 280 meters. He then switched from his main air tank to his backup at 450 feet, or 137 meters. By this time, both of his air tanks were empty. He had to grab the staged air that he left on his original descent. Stage air is left while descending for divers to use back on their ascent to the surface. To Jim's horror, when he turned on the new air tank, the regulator broke off from the valve violently. This was a major problem and caused him to panic, but somehow he was able to reattach it. This was a major problem.
Walnut.
Every second felt like an eternity. If he didn't fix this, he would drown.
Okay, so let me talk about this for a second. Because what he just talked about was the fact that when he opened the tank and the line was pressurized, the second stage regulator, the thing that goes into his mouth, popped out. Like it just got out of the hose. So I guess while assuming he's holding his breath, close the tank because the tank is bleeding at that point. Close it, reattach the second stage, open it, and start breathing. So we actually learned from issues like this. And now when we leave tanks, which we do, we stage tanks in some of our dives that we do, longer penetrations, we actually leave them pressurized. So even though the tank is closed, and you leave it closed because if the regulator fails, let's say starts free flowing, you don't want to come back to a tank that is completely empty. But we leave it pressurized so when we open it, something like this doesn't happen. So we literally open it, there's pressure in the line, we make sure everything works, right? We breathe from it, regulator works, everything is pressurized, and we close the tank, but we don't bleed the line out. The line stays pressurized. So when you open it again, if you need it, that pressure is already there. Nothing is going to pop out and blow up like it happened to Jim.
And especially, we don't want that to happen at 400 plus feet when you're narked out of your mind.
And air.
Have the wits to hold your breath and put that thing back together while you're like barely functioning mentally. That's what's really amazing.
Yeah.
He ended up having to switch back to a different air tank because he couldn't fix the regulator.
Okay. Oh.
The only solution was to open and close the valve with each breath. He had 8 minutes of stops
Put his mouth on the
between
tank.
350 feet or 100
can do
meters
that.
and where the next stage bottle was. He could breathe easier when he made it to the staged air with a properly functioning regulator.
Of course.
Now would come the really long decompression and the worry about oxygen toxicity and barotrauma. Luckily for Jim, he is able to switch to another air tank at 250 feet or 80 meters. That's when he knew something was very wrong with Sheck. At 130 feet or 40 meters above him, the sun was set below the ridge surrounding the cave. He could clearly observe the line Sheck used on his descent. All of his stage bottles were still neatly packaged and unused. The sinking feeling in his heart was overcome by the confidence that Sheck had gone deeper and that he was probably still below Jim. Sheck was known to do this while diving, but Jim was still surprised he would dive that deep in such a dangerous sinkhole. On the surface, the support team already knew Sheck was in trouble, and Kristovich had watched the bubble paths of both men on the initial descent. Jim's bubbles disappeared at 2 minutes, and Sheck's vanished a few seconds later as they both reached the ledge at 250 feet or 75 meters. Only one set of bubbles reappeared after about 15 minutes, and she couldn't be sure if they were Jim's or Sheck's. And Kristovich exchanged uneasy glances with Jim's wife, Karen. As planned, she then dived to meet Jim at the 47-minute mark of his dive profile. She was relieved to find him, but chilled to see Sheck's stage equipment still hanging with no sign of him. The grim awareness of the situation gripped the pair. Meanwhile, Mary was watching from the cliffs with no knowledge of the problem. She joined Jim's wife at the surface and assessed the situation. Concerned, but not panicked by the situation, she grabbed an extra stage bottle to take to Sheck and swam down to encounter Jim and Anne. Now her worst fears were becoming reality. She hastily wrote on the dive slate that she is going to go to 250 feet or 75 meters to look for bubbles. Dropping over the deep ledge, she could find no sign of Sheck or any bubbles coming from the depths. Jim's wife had scrambled into her gear and caught up with Mary. She met Mary Ellen at about 150 feet or 30 meters on her way back up. She was crying and her mask was messed up. She wanted to go back to the surface, but Jim grabbed her gauge and saw that it read 278 feet or 85 meters. All he could do was hold her. They stayed down there for more than 30 minutes to get through the decompression. It was a very lonely time. Jim was finally told that Sheck was lost as he reached the 60-foot stop or 20 meters. He felt himself grow numb from the loss and describes the remainder of his decompression as a mechanical exercise, with little conscious thought. After a total of nearly 10 hours, he surfaced. It was a horrible moment for Jim. They knew the risks that they were taking, but still it was hard to imagine Sheck not surviving the dive. Jim was now the first diver to successfully break the 900-foot or 274-meter barrier on self-contained scuba air. His record depth of 925 feet or 280 meters eclipsed Sheck's old 881-foot mark or 270 meters. There is no consideration given to mounting a body recovery for Sheck, since it was accepted that the only man capable of such a recovery was the man who was already down there.
Sheck.
3 days later, while hoisting up the remainder of the equipment, Sheck's body was found. He had apparently drifted up from the deep cave passage and become entangled in line. One of his tanks still had gas, and his computer read 904 feet or 274 meters,
Wow.
suggesting that whatever trouble he had did not occur until 9 minutes into the dive. The best educated guess would be to point to his high-pressure nervous syndrome incident. Sheck had experienced a bad one in Africa that resulted in uncontrollable muscle spasms and multiple vision. This may have manifested again with more violent tremors that could have triggered an oxygen convulsion or simply made it impossible to negotiate gas switches as necessary. Sheck's loss shocked and saddened the entire world community of diving explorers. To this day, he is considered one of the foremost leaders in cave diving and mixed gas diving techniques. He truly led the way for others that followed in his footsteps.
He did. And I think, I want to say a couple things. So the first thing is Sheck Exley is also used as an example of why cave diving is dangerous, right? People use his name to say the guy who invented cave diving died. So how can you even dare to say cave diving is safe? It's impossible. The guy who invented it died.
Well, we don't. Who says it's safe?
Well, yeah, and we've said this before. It's not safe for untrained people, of course, but
it's inherently very, very dangerous to cave dive.
Yep.
Inherently. We mitigate those risks through proper training. That's the way to describe it.
What I mentioned when I answer those comments, and I've answered them in the past, is that Sheck Exley died doing a world record dive into a sinkhole that for them, they didn't even know how deep it was. He died because he had issues that are related to deep diving, nothing to do with cave diving. He wasn't cave diving when he died. There are some stories, though, about Sheck Exley in terms of how they found his body. One of those stories is that he had the presence of mind to realize that he wasn't going to make it, and he actually tied himself to the line. Like on the video, the guy mentioned that when they pulled the equipment, they pulled the line, they pulled his body, and he was entangled with it. A lot of people said, look, there's no way Sheck Exley was going to be entangled in line. A cave diver entangled in a vertical line, that doesn't make any sense. Maybe it makes sense if he's narked or having problems. But the theory is that in order for them to find his body, he tied himself to the line and said, okay, I'm going to die anyway, so I'm going to tie my body to it, and then he died. So that was another, story from his passing. But an absolute legend, pushing the limits. This is one of those things. This is one of those things, deep diving like that, 900 feet, 1,000 feet. I think the record's over 1,000 right now, that I'm not very attracted to. Like, I have zero interest in establishing world records for depth.
That's good, because we weren't thinking you were going to be the guy to do that.
Yeah, but I just don't see the attraction to it, other than, okay, you own the world record.
Now, that brings up a thought that I was having. Why do people push records?
Yeah.
Or you could say, why did these divers want to push this record? And here's what I commonly respond on that. That is what we do as human beings in the world to progress. And it's not that we would push that record. There are certain people that have the ability, the presence of mind, or even the courage to take things to the next level. You could say that with astronauts, with pilots that are testing speed records with airplanes, with, on and on, with computers, with NASA guys, that how much pressure can the human body take, with drugs that have been developed to save people's lives. Unfortunately, a lot of times, many times, in order for us to learn in any realm, forget just diving, because I know people are gonna hone in on just diving, but in everything, it takes guys like Sheck Exley for us to progress in an activity, and that's what has happened in diving, and a lot of it is attributed to him. And it's like I said, it's happened in many other realms of the world for people that were willing to push limits. And those are like 1% of 1% of the population within their specific field. So that maybe will cut off some of the comments of why he was an idiot. Why would he ever do that and so forth? Well, you could say that about anything ever developed in the world.
Right. We hope that you enjoy learning about Sheck Exley. Again, an absolute legend, and not the first time we cover something that happened to Sheck. He wrote some books where he tells some stories, especially of his dives at Peacock Springs, which we love and have dived there many, many times. Like, he barely made it. So Sheck Exley had a lot of close calls. And one of those close calls we actually reacted to in this channel, and I'm going to leave it right here so you guys can check it out. Thank you so much for sticking with us, and Woody, thank you for the opening. Good job.
Bye, everybody.